She stood in the driveway, holding a handwritten sign that said $1. The car behind her was worth $500,000, and she was smiling. That image burned into the memory of everyone who drove past Maple Creek Drive that Saturday morning in the fall of 1990. But nobody knew the full story yet. Nobody knew what Dennis had done. Nobody knew how far Sandra had been pushed before she finally snapped. And nobody could have imagined what happened next, because what started as an act of revenge turned into something that would change Sandra's life forever in ways she never saw coming. Stay right there, because in the next few minutes you are going to hear one of the most jaw-dropping stories to ever come out of a quiet Ohio suburb. And I promise you, the ending is going to leave you completely speechless. Sandra Lynn Kowalski was 34 years old in the summer of 1990, and by every measure that mattered in their neighborhood, she had built a good life. She had married Dennis Kowalski when they were both 22, fresh out of college, starry-eyed and full of plans. Dennis had gone into automotive sales, climbing fast through dealership ranks until he landed a regional director position that paid more money than either of them had ever imagined growing up in working-class Cleveland. Sandra had put her own accounting degree to use, keeping the books for a small pediatric clinic on the east side of town, a job she genuinely loved. Surrounded by kids and dedicated doctors and a team that felt like family. They had a house with a big backyard. They had a golden retriever named Chester. They had 2 cars in the garage and weekend barbecues and a circle of friends who called them the couple everyone wanted to be. From the outside, Dennis and Sandra Kowalski were the definition of making it, but Sandra had been noticing things for about 8 months before everything fell apart. Little things at first. Dennis coming home later than usual with explanations that were just slightly too smooth. A new cologne she had never bought him. The way his phone screen would go dark the moment she walked into the room. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself that successful men had busy lives, and she was reading too much into things. She told herself that Dennis loved her, and that 12 years of marriage meant something. She was right that 12 years meant something. She just had no idea yet exactly what it meant to Dennis. The moment everything changed was an ordinary Wednesday in October. Sandra had left work early because a migraine had been building behind her eyes since noon, and she had pulled into the driveway expecting an empty house. Dennis was supposed to be in Columbus for a regional sales conference. His car was not supposed to be there, but it was. His car and another one she did not recognize, a cherry-red Pontiac Firebird parked halfway on the lawn like whoever was driving it had been in a hurry. Sandra sat in her own car for a full minute, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel, telling herself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe a colleague had given him a ride. Maybe the conference had been cancelled. Maybe she was about to walk into something completely innocent. She was not about to walk into something completely innocent. She used her key, she opened the front door quietly, and she heard voices coming from the direction of the master bedroom. A woman's laugh. Low music playing from the clock radio on Dennis's nightstand. The same clock radio Sandra had given him as a birthday gift 3 years ago. She stood in the hallway of her own home, listening to her husband and another woman inside the room where she slept every night, and something inside Sandra Kowalski went very, very still. She did not cry. She did not scream. She walked back out the front door, sat in her car, and waited. 15 minutes later, the woman came out first. Sandra had never seen her before, but she would later find out her name was Cheryl Hutchins, 26 years old, a receptionist at one of the dealerships Dennis oversaw. Cheryl walked to the red Firebird, tossed her hair, got in, and drove away without ever noticing Sandra sitting 20 feet from her in the driveway. Dennis came out 2 minutes after that, dressed like he was heading to the office, and the look on his face when he saw Sandra's car was something she would never forget. Not guilt, not shame, just a kind of tired resignation, like a man who had been waiting for a problem to arrive and was mildly annoyed that it had finally shown up. They talked in the kitchen for 2 hours. Or rather, Dennis talked, and Sandra sat at the table she had picked out at a furniture store in 1983 and listened to her husband explain that he and Cheryl had been together for 7 months, that he had feelings for her that he could not explain, and that he felt, and this was the word he used, he felt that it was time to be honest, as if honesty was something he was doing for Sandra's benefit, as if the previous 7 months of lying had been some kind of kindness. Sandra asked him one question. She asked him if he wanted to end their marriage. Dennis said yes. He moved out the following weekend. He took his clothes, his golf clubs, his collection of classic rock albums, and the framed photo of the two of them at Niagara Falls that had been sitting on the bookshelf since their honeymoon. He left the furniture, the dog, the mortgage, and 12 years of a life they had built together. He also left the car. Now this is where the story becomes something else entirely, and this is what you came here for, so let me tell you about the car. 3 years earlier, in 1987, Dennis had purchased a 1957 Ferrari 250 GT Berlinetta. It was his obsession, his pride, the thing he talked about at dinner parties and polished in the garage on Sunday mornings, while Sandra made coffee inside. He had paid $480,000 for it, which was most of their savings at the time, and Sandra had signed the paperwork alongside him because they were married, and that was what married people did. The car was registered in both their names. Sandra had never particularly cared about it. She was not a car person. She had signed because Dennis had asked her to, and because she had trusted him. That signature would turn out to be the most important thing Sandra Kowalski had ever done. When Dennis moved out, he assumed Sandra would store the Ferrari in the garage and wait for their attorneys to work out the division of assets. He assumed she would be reasonable. He assumed that she was as devastated as she looked in those first few days, too heartbroken and disoriented to do anything but wait. Dennis had made a significant miscalculation about who Sandra Lynn Kowalski actually was. She spent 3 weeks doing research. She talked to her attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Delgado, who had handled divorces in Cuyahoga County for 15 years, and who, when Sandra explained what she was thinking, set down her pen, looked at her client across the desk and said, "And I want to be clear that this is not legal advice for what you are about to do, but off the record, you have every right." Sandra placed an ad in the Cleveland Plain Dealer on a Friday morning. 3 lines. 1 photograph. The asking price was $1. The ad read, 1957 Ferrari 250 GT Berlinetta, excellent condition, all original parts, 1 careful owner, selling for $1, first come, first served, cash only, no trades. The phone started ringing before the morning edition had finished printing. She had over 60 calls by noon. She took the first caller who could prove they had $1 cash and could be at her house within 2 hours. His name was Robert Tillman. A mechanic from Parma who had seen the ad assumed it was a misprint, called anyway on the theory that he had nothing to lose, and arrived at Maple Creek Drive at 1:30 in the afternoon with a single dollar bill folded in his shirt pocket and an expression on his face like a man who was absolutely convinced this was either a dream or some kind of elaborate prank. It was neither. Sandra walked him to the garage. She showed him the car. He circled it twice without speaking. Then he looked at her and said, "Ma'am, are you sure about this?" Sandra said she had never been more sure of anything in her life. She took his dollar. She signed over the title, her name, and her name alone on the seller's line. Perfectly legal, perfectly valid. Robert Tillman drove that Ferrari out of her garage and onto Maple Creek Drive, and Sandra stood in the driveway watching him go. And that was the moment a neighbor taking her dog for a walk saw Sandra standing there with a handwritten sign, smiling in the afternoon light like a woman who had just put down the heaviest thing she had ever carried. Dennis found out 3 hours later. He called Sandra's phone 11 times. She answered on the 12th call. His voice was not calm. He said things that this channel is not going to repeat. He told her she had no right, that the car was his, that she had stolen from him, that she was going to regret this for the rest of her life. Sandra waited until he ran out of words. Then she reminded him quietly and very precisely that the car had been in both their names, that she had every legal right to sell her share of jointly owned marital property, and that she had sold it for fair market value as determined by the two of them together at the time of purchase, since at the time of purchase, Dennis had told her the car was worth exactly what she now agreed it was worth to their marriage. $1. She hung up the phone. Now here is the part of this story that nobody expected. And this is the twist, the real one. The one that turned Sandra's act of revenge into something that would follow her for the rest of her life in ways that had nothing to do with Dennis. Robert Tillman, the mechanic from Parma who had paid $1 for a $500,000 Ferrari, was not a collector. He was not wealthy. He was a 41-year-old man who'd been working on cars since he was 16, and who 3 years earlier had lost most of his savings trying to keep his younger brother's auto repair business afloat after a flood destroyed the shop. He had a wife named Diane and 2 kids in elementary school, and he drove a 1984 pickup truck that needed a new transmission. Robert did not keep the Ferrari for himself. He drove it directly to a classic car auction house in Beechwood, consigned it the same afternoon, and when it sold 6 weeks later for $512,000, Robert Tillman walked away with a check that changed his family's entire trajectory. But here is what Robert did first, before the auction, before the money. He went back to Maple Creek Drive. He knocked on Sandra's door. He stood on her porch, holding a bakery box with a coffee cake inside. And he told her that he did not know what had happened to make her sell that car the way she did, but that whatever it was, he hoped she was going to be all right. He said his father had always told him that when life gives you something unexpected, the only decent thing to do is pay it forward. He left her the coffee cake. He went home, and 3 weeks after the Ferrari sold at auction, a check arrived at Sandra's house. Not for $500,000, for $25,000. A note was attached, written in handwriting that looked like a man who had learned to write by signing repair orders, and it said, "I looked up what the right thing to do was. I talked to my pastor and my wife, and I came up with this number because it felt fair. I hope it helps you start over. I hope whatever he did to you, you come out of it stronger. God bless you." Sandra sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Dennis had explained his feelings for Cheryl Hutchins 7 months earlier, and she cried for the first time since October. Not because of the money, though the money would help cover the attorney fees and the months of mortgage she would be carrying alone. She cried because a stranger, a complete stranger with $1 in his shirt pocket, had walked into the worst chapter of her life and shown her more decency than the man she had spent 12 years building a life with. If you are still watching this, and you have not subscribed to this channel yet, right now is the moment to do it. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications, because we tell stories like this every single week. Stories about real courage, real betrayal, real humanity, and real comebacks, and you do not want to miss a single one. The divorce was finalized in the spring of 1991. Dennis and Cheryl eventually moved to Columbus. The relationship did not last, though that part of the story belongs to someone else. Sandra kept the house on Maple Creek Drive, kept Chester the golden retriever, and kept her job at the pediatric clinic where she had worked for 9 years. She also took the $25,000 from Robert Tillman and enrolled in a real estate licensing program at Cuyahoga Community College, something she had thought about doing years earlier but had never pursued because building Dennis's career had always seemed more pressing than building her own. She got her license in the fall of 1991. She sold her first property in December of that year. By 1995, she had her broker's license and a small but growing reputation in the East Side residential market. She and Robert Tillman stayed in touch for years. His family came to her open houses. She helped him and Diane find a bigger home in 1994 when their third child was on the way. He fixed her truck for free every time something went wrong with it. They became the kind of friends that you do not have a category for, the kind that arrive from completely unexpected directions and turn out to be exactly what you needed without either of you ever planning it. As for the car, the 1957 Ferrari 250 GT Berlinetta that Dennis Kowalski had polished in the garage on Sunday mornings, while Sandra made coffee inside, it was purchased at auction by a collector in Scottsdale, Arizona. It sat in a climate-controlled garage for years, driven maybe twice a decade at charity events and car shows, which is probably not so different from what its life would have been in Cleveland. Beautiful things sometimes end up exactly where they were always going, regardless of the hands they pass through on the way. What no one ever forgot in Maple Creek Drive or anywhere else the story spread was that image from that Saturday afternoon in October 1990. A woman standing in a driveway holding a handwritten sign that said $1, a car worth $500,000 behind her. And on her face, not anger, not bitterness, not the expression of a woman in the middle of losing something. The expression of a woman who had just figured out exactly what she was worth. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments below. If you had been in Sandra's position, would you have sold that car for $1? And do you think what she did was wrong, or do you think Dennis got exactly what he deserved? Drop your answer down there because I genuinely want to know what you think, and I read every single comment on this channel. The dollar bill that Robert Tillman handed Sandra on that October afternoon ended up framed on the wall of her real estate office. She hung it there in 1993 when she opened her own brokerage, right next to her license and her first commission check. People who came into the office for the first time always asked about it. She always told them the same thing. She said it was a reminder that sometimes the things that cost the least end up meaning the most, and sometimes the things you think are worth $500,000 turn out to be worth exactly $1. Depends entirely on who you are and what you are willing to let go of to find out. Dennis Kowalski never found out about Robert Tillman's check. Some things belong only to the people who earned them.